listener production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of interpersonal violence and abuse. Please listen with care. For 20 years, Sheree Spencer subjected her husband to horrific physical, emotional and financial abuse. Similarly, Jordan Worth controlled, beat, stabbed, starved and tortured her boyfriend, becoming the first woman in UK history to be convicted of coercive control-related offences. As society grapples with the overwhelming issue of men's violence against women, our understanding of domestic violence is expanding, and we're uncovering the lesser-known reality of female perpetrators and male victims. In this episode, hear from Dr. Jenny McKay, a forensic psychologist specialising in the psychology of women who commit interpersonal violence. Gain an understanding into the nuanced differences and similarities between male and female perpetrators and what these insights mean for tackling domestic abuse in all its forms. My name's Catherine Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world. We understand domestic violence against women and we understand how lethal it is, but this is a lesser known and lesser talked about issue, and we're not in any way trying to make it all an equivalence. But I think your work definitely highlights something that we need to raise awareness about. And Baby Reindeer, for example, the successful television series about a stalking woman who really messed with her victim's mind and mental health, that's raised some awareness. But I'd like to ask you if that's good and bad, the awareness that's raised.
I think you're right. Our normative narrative is around the strong, big male perpetrator and the weak, vulnerable female victim. And that has quite rightly so been our narrative for some time now. And then we see these flashes of cases where we see women in the media using really quite horrific violence and abuse against their partners, ex-partners, people that they've been intimate with. And Baby Reindeer was a great example of kind of showcasing the levels that a woman might go to in certain cases. And the good thing about that is that we are raising the profile then for men, if we talk about this in a very kind of binary heterosexual way, heteronormative way for a second, it raises that profile for men who have been victims of intimate partner violence and abuse, and where they have experienced very similar patterns of abuse towards them as women have been describing to us for some time as well. I guess the bad side of that is that it is these extreme cases that we see, which then tends to, again, kind of almost make it feel like it's something that's really extreme and rare and happens once in a blue moon. And we maybe don't need to worry about it too much, which I would probably argue is not necessarily correct. So they appear to be these quite extreme cases then that are so rare that we maybe don't need to talk about it. But I would argue that we absolutely do. And it's something that we need to kind of bring into our narrative around domestic violence quite a bit more.
Can you take us through a couple of cases, for example, to show what we're talking about and how serious intimate partner violence against men can be?
Quite recently, we've had a couple of cases in the UK that have been quite exposing and quite harrowing to watch and see. So we recently had earlier this year, a documentary was aired over here in which showcased a chap called Richard Spencer and his wife, Sheree Spencer, who Sheree worked for our prison service here. And the documentary followed them through where some footage had been captured on their nanny cams, which demonstrated the kind of abuse that Sheree was perpetrating against Richard. So there were examples of quite extreme physical harm. There were examples of using household items as weapons against Richard. But what was quite interesting was we also saw, and Sheree was convicted of coercive controlling behaviour, we saw that pattern of emotional, verbal, psychological abuse that was perpetrated by her against him. And that included things like, without kind of thinking of the most extreme examples in there was a lot of constant humiliation of him, standing over and shouting at him, threatening with weapons, using the children as a method of threatening him not to say anything, which again is an interesting, when we look at women's abuse against men, it's an interesting point that seems to come up quite a lot in terms of a common theme when we ask men about their experiences as victims. So threatening with not seeing them again, threatening with removing contact with them, with who will believe that person. I'll call the police and tell them you hit me, they're more likely to believe me. So using that kind of legal administrative abuse, which I think is a term that colleague and friend Liz Bates has used before. And so we saw that in that case. We saw that kind of constant pattern of that threatening and intimidating behaviour that then went alongside some quite severe physical abuse as well. That was not dissimilar to a case that was again in the media a few years back. I think it was, if I remember correctly, it was the first woman in the UK to have been convicted of the new coercive controlling behaviour offence. A young woman called Jordan Worth and her partner Alex Skeel. And again, there was a BBC documentary that covered that particular case, where we saw that similar pattern of the emotional and psychological abuse, as well as some quite severe physical abuse as well. For example, things like dictating where Alex was allowed to sleep or when he was allowed to sleep, waking him up with, threatening poses, for example, sort of being over him at night time, that kind of thing. And they're just kind of small snippets of examples of some of that violence and abuse that was perpetrated within those relationships. And then again, that progressed to some quite severe, potentially fatal physical abuse in that case as well. So she'd used the kind of final piece of evidence was around her using a knife against Alex, who managed to defend himself. But in both those cases, it took quite a lot of persistence from what we see in the documentaries, is a lot of persistence from the police in kind of keeping on asking the right questions of the men for them to admit that was what was happening. Otherwise, it seemed to be hidden for a very long time, which again is very similar to what we see in cases where it's male perpetrator, female victim. That notion of the abuse, it continues, it's underlying, it's there as a thread throughout the relationship and quite hidden for quite a period of time as well.
I was stunned that I think Alex was 22, as was his partner, and they'd been a couple since they were 16. And that's 6 years of not knowing any different of that behaviour, 6 years investment into that relationship from, I imagine, the intense moments of teen love. And you can kind of understand that suspending disbelief, for a while. But what was really interesting to me was that Richard Spencer had been married 20 years to his wife. And the behaviour, there's no other way to say this, it was like a wounded animal. Him in those images was so sad. He never got up from the lounge when she was assaulting him. He actually went more into a fetal position, never answered back because he knew clearly that would escalate. And in a way, it was almost as if his wife was goading him to respond so she could escalate. And his learnt behaviour was to cower, go deadly quiet while he was being told. It was like a child or a very abused animal in terms of that withdrawn behaviour. And I think it's an incredibly powerful and frightening thing to see. We can understand women in that position. We don't seem to have any problem with that. And that's exactly how some women do behave in response to constant intimidation and violence. But to see men behaving like this, you expect the alpha male or the testosterone to come out or something, but that didn't happen in any of the recordings that we see.
Because we don't expect to see that, that makes it all the more hard to believe. It makes it all the more difficult to conceive that that might be happening, which serves the purpose of keeping men as victims and other genders, other relationships with other sexualities. It keeps the abuse in those relationships really hidden and makes it very difficult for people to stand up and say, look, this is what's going on to me. I'd hope and I'd like to think that we're in a position when we talk about women as victims that we have moved on from where we were 30, 40 years ago, in that there is more space for women to come forward and say that I don't think we get it right all the time. Absolutely not. There's still a lot of work to be done. But I always feel like we're way back where we were with women for men at the minute, that because we've got this disbelief around it and because we can't imagine that a man, again, thinking of our gender stereotype, would put up with that behaviour, who could physically overpower the other person in front of them, but choose not to, or are trapped into not doing so because of all the other abuse that's going on in the background. It kind of adds that layer of difficulty on for them to come forward, and for us to believe that women might be able to perpetrate that kind of abuse. I sort of think back in memory of other cases that have been in the past, and quite often the female perpetrator, the woman who is perpetrating in these cases, is often very small, not particularly tall, not particularly strong. So it can't just be about the physicality of abuse that we're talking about here. It is about these patterns of intimidation, the learned behaviour, the relational dynamics that unfortunately, really sadly, perpetuate that abuse and enable it to keep on going. And then, like I say, our stereotypes, our talk around it, our narrative around gender stereotypes makes it really, really difficult for people to come forward.
It's really intriguing to me that you get a group of women around who are married or in relationships, and invariably sometime talk will become of the mothers-in-law. And just about almost all of them will be whinging about the behaviour of the mother-in-law, and to the point where it's a trope in some cases. I mean, even Jane Fonda played mother-in-law from hell in Mother-in-Law. And we understood the gaslighting, the lying, the nastiness, the threatening the daughter-in-law. We seem to accept that mothers-in-law can do that to daughters-in-law, and we accept that some women, mothers, are abusive to their children. We accept that they can be horrific parenting and emotionally abusive and withdraw love and do all those sort of things. Why do we have such trouble thinking that a woman could do that to her own partner?
It's a really great question. And I don't know if we know exactly why that is. The stereotype around the mother-in-law is a really easy one. I say the word easy in inverted commas. It's a really easy one to make funny and to make as entertainment. And actually, I think in some respects, the female partner is abusive is also historically been something that has been for entertainment purposes. There's an episode in Friends where Joey has a very small, petite girlfriend who regularly punches him, and it's part of the kind of comedy of that episode. So for to some extent, some of the acceptance, I think, is around how that has been, I guess, maybe some form of entertainment or something that we are able to make light of and make jokes around. And I almost think that's where, again, I'm going to kind of just leave out the discussion around mothers and children for a second and not include that, because I think that's something that we absolutely do not normalise and make light of. But in terms of that kind of the mother-in-law and the intimate relationship, that normalisation of it becomes then, let's again use the stereotype of the women sat around having coffee, having a glass of wine, talking about these things, is that we're almost enabled to talk about that and not be challenged on it. I think there's a sense of, eye roll. I've had to put up with this from my mother-in-law, or I've had to put up with this from my partner, and how I dealt with this was that, and it's almost seen as some kind of girl power issue. We can retaliate,
a bonding,
a way of bonding, and we can retaliate to something we're not happy with by, I see this quite a lot on social media in terms of women talking about, I found this on my partner's phone, I found this on my husband's phone. Or if the gender roles are reversed in those situations, we would not be able to have that conversation publicly, because the man will be told, he will be questioned on why is he looking through his partner's phone? Is this part of the pattern of controlling behaviour? Is he controlling who his wife, partner speaks to, talks to, what they do on social media, etc.? But we just have this, like I said, this narrative around that being quite normal and quite okay that we do that as women in relationships. I just come out and say I do not do that in a relationship. But there is this sense of it being okay to say those things and not be challenged on it.
What would you do if your boyfriend or husband was unfaithful? And cheering on social media women slay queen if they propose violence against the woman or against the man. How is that something you should be cheering for and cheering on?
Yeah, absolutely. When I've interviewed women who are in prison who have been convicted of offences that are related to domestic violence, that is something that that offence type is not unusual. That it's, I have suffered something from my partner, like a cheating incident or not pulling their weight, or whatever it might be, that suggests the relationship was not in a good place. And so the reason that they were in prison is because they have then, and we're talking about obviously the extreme ends of the extreme end of cases here, and these people are in prison, so it does something horrific. But we then talk about people setting up robberies on their ex-partners to threaten and intimidate. So that's a way in which a woman might use, again, very extreme case, but might use violence and abuse to get back at somebody. But when we have that, the lauding of that on social media with people who haven't been in prison and maybe don't have criminal records, but that's okay, that we celebrate this, this, like you say, the kind of slay queen, you go girl, you do what you need to do, then it just breeds that sense of it being normal and normalising that women can act in that way in relationships and go unchallenged and unchecked, which again serves that purpose of keeping certain victims hidden from society, from our talk around this issue. So we almost need to have this open conversation about everybody's behaviour and everybody's use of abusive behaviour, so that we can protect everybody. This isn't about the what about men. It's not about the minimising women's experiences, but we ironically make everybody more vulnerable when we don't talk about all these facets of violence and abuse.
The whole concept of romance and love and unconditional love in our society, I wonder if that is part of the problem that brings so much disillusionment. Because I remember watching Sleepless in Seattle the first time. Everyone thought it was so romantic with Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks. I thought it was a stalker film. I thought she was completely irrational. So I've never found the rom-coms particularly satisfying, but does that give people this sort of unconditional love concept, and I don't even know if that's a real thing anymore, rather than setting up boundaries, believing, oh, but he loves me, but he watches me and turns up everywhere I am because he loves me. It's romantic. He's texting me 400 times a day because, oh my gosh, he's love bombing me, but he loves me and it's flattering, and I'm feeling really good dopamine every time he texts me or she texts me. Do you think that expectations of relationships and that not admitting we need to set boundaries is a problem in relationships that can become extremely dysfunctional and violent?
100%. And I think what we're actually talking about here is people's attachment styles. So the way they have learnt and kind of been almost blueprinted to understand what an intimate relationship should look like. So when we think about attachment theory, it tells us that the way we attach emotionally with our early years caregivers can almost set the tone for how life then continues on for us in all our other ongoing future adult intimate relationships. So if we have a position where a baby, a toddler, a preschooler, as they're growing, have quite strong emotional, healthy attachments to their caregivers, and boundaries are set in a respectful, gentle way, and the child learns about disappointment in a safe way and can deal with that, and the child learns to emotionally regulate, that we tend to see that's what they will then carry forward into their adult relationships as well. Not always perfect, but it gives a sense of what healthy looks like. I feel secure in myself. I feel trust and security in the person I'm with until something threatens that, until I'm given reason to question that, then we go through life in that way. For some of us, we've had a very different experience growing up, and we have maybe not known where the sense of safety and security comes from. And we may feel that in order to gain the love and affection and warmth from somebody, child might have learned to do that by potentially by, I guess, what would classically be called maybe naughty behaviour, and they kind of, learn to cry, to cling, it's a sense of not knowing where that warmth is coming from. So they'll try anything to get it, if that makes sense. And again, that we see quite often, not always, but that carries through into adult relationships. So I think there's kind of two pulling forces there. We've got this sense of what the media and society tells us is, as you describe, unconditional love, perfect relationships, that we try hard to get somebody, or it's all encompassing. It's overwhelming, but that's love. That's what love is. And then we might have this portion of the population who have grown up also believing that's what love is like based on their early relationships, and carry that through. So, and need to be with somebody all the time in order to feel love, and need to have a certain response given to them in order, that means I'm loved, no sense of boundaries or whatever that might be. So we tend to refer to it as somebody maybe being insecurely attached, and they perhaps might demonstrate avoidant type behaviours, or they might demonstrate anxious, clingy, for want of a better word, type behaviours to that person they're with as well. So I think what we're talking about here is those kind of attachment styles. And when we have a clash of that then in a relationship, so if we can imagine that we've got somebody who maybe is rather anxiously attached, that they feel they need constant love, constant reassurance, constant closeness, their partner can't do anything else without them, whatever that might look like. And then we might have somebody who is pretty avoidant, who shuts down, who can't cope with that closeness, who needs more than enough boundaries and space. We might then see the potential for that clash there then. And if we add on to that layers of unhelpful negotiation skills, unable to regulate emotions particularly well, if we add on some layers of things like substance misuse. So we've seen, again, just going back to some of the cases we've seen. So in the Spencer case, very clearly, Sheree had a problem with alcohol. So we add on those kind of layers of risk, and we've got this perfect storm in relationships for that to happen.
So out of those partners and attachments and dysfunctions, is there a difference between the male and the female coercive control abuser?
If we kind of just go back a little bit and think about domestic violence more broadly, which some researchers argue that actually in order for us to label behaviour as domestic violence, we need to see an element of coercive control. Actually, women and men as perpetrators are more similar than they are different, is what the research tends to show us. So there are some small nuanced differences that are important, but generally speaking, we tend to see very similar, what we would refer to in the field as criminogenic needs. So they are the needs that are what we'd call the risk factors. So the things that exist in somebody's past or in their present life that raise the risk that they're going to perpetrate violence or abuse in a relationship. And we tend to find that men and women have fairly similar profiles when we look at those criminogenic needs. With my own research with, again, people who are in prison, so those kind of the again, more extreme cases, the main differences lie in how isolated the women feel. That was something that came through when I spoke to women. So we see very similar trauma histories, more sexual abuse for the women in their past, which again is probably not surprising. And what we would generally tend to see is that women do tend to have been more likely to be sexually abused as children and as adults. But the sense of isolation is what really came through as a key difference between the men and women who perpetrated. So for men, the violence in their lives was very normalised. They were able to find friends and buddies in kind of all walks of life, even if that was antisocial type behaviour. There'd be people that they could hang around with and create connections with, even if they were negative type connections. But for the women, and I think this comes back to saying, what do we perceive as normative around women? So for these extreme clinical type cases, these women were identified quite early on in life as so different to everybody else that they found it really hard to create friendships and to create other relationships with people in their lives. And then I think we see then, so where another difference we see in the literature is that men as perpetrators tend to be the avoidantly attached individuals. Women as perpetrators tend to be the anxiously attached individuals. So where we've got women who have been felt very isolated from peers, from teachers, from family throughout their life as they grow up, and then are anxiously attached to people or can become anxiously attached to people, the boundaries are almost non-existent in the relationships that they talk to me about, and they used violence and abuse as a way of hanging on to the person that they were with. So as a way to kind of to demonstrate to them, to the people they're with, you belong to me, you're not going anywhere, you're mine. So that kind of
disempowering them, completely disempowering them.
Absolutely, yes. And also for the women, a sense of, I've been hurt so much before, and I know that's not right, that I will get in there first if I think you're going to hurt me. And again, kind of women describing what sounds a bit like retaliation. I've been hurt, so I will hurt you back. But actually, it's quite proactively, I'm going to show you that, lashing out, and I'm going to show you that I am not going to take this. I won't take this behaviour anymore. As opposed to the men who, like I say, still carried a sense of chivalry, and then they knew in their heads, well, we don't hit women, but men don't hit women. That's, that is the case. But because the violence, the abuse is just so normalised in their lives growing up, that's what they see, that's what they're exposed to. they're, labelled the naughty kid at school and they're excluded, but it doesn't matter because there's plenty of other boys who have done that same thing and who also get excluded. And then within relationships, then again, for want of a better word, put up with just generally kind of toxic, horrid relationships. So there's kind of, like I say, more similarities than there are differences, but those differences are really important for us to understand. So I would argue that when we're thinking about interventions with people who've perpetrated domestic violence, I would argue we don't necessarily need to be gender-led, but we definitely need to be gender-informed, because those differences there might not have a huge difference on what we present as an intervention, to people who've perpetrated, but we're really going to need to think carefully about this individual's experience and how their gender has had an impact on that, and how we kind of help that person improve their quality of life and improve their skills in a way that enables them not to perpetrate violence and abuse again.
Are women who abuse more likely to have had abusive mothers or fathers?
That again, so there is some indication in the literature that pattern might hold, that where we see that the kind of, it's often referred to as the intergenerational transmission of violence. So where people have been exposed to that violence growing up, that they, I guess, replicate that. There is some indication in the literature that might be led by gender. So where they see women being violent and abusive, but it's not as clear cut as that. Again, there's no real evidence that exists that suggests to us that definitely is the case. But actually, it's more about the general exposure to, we used to refer to it as witnessing domestic violence growing up, but actually we talk about it as being exposed to domestic violence growing up, because both women and men don't just passively witness these events that happen. They're now considered victims in England and Wales of domestic violence if they have been exposed to it. That's how serious we take that now. So actually what's more important is where individuals have grown up and have been exposed to it, regardless of who's perpetrating. That's what's important. That is a traumatic experience in and of itself that can have an impact on somebody as they grow. Again, not everybody, but it can have that impact on individuals, and is definitely linked with those who then go on to perpetrate. But of course, just to caveat that with, it doesn't mean if we've been exposed to domestic violence growing up that we're going to go on to perpetrate, but there's definitely a link there somewhere.
Because I know studies have sort of suggested that if there's a violent male in the household, male sons are how many times more likely to commit violence against a woman, but the girls are more likely to be victims of a violent male. So is the work just not there on female offenders, do you think? I
think that's what it is that we just don't have the evidence there in terms of women and when they've gone on to offend. It's, I think, again, because a part of our narrative has not been to necessarily talk much or understand much about women who've perpetrated. We are kind of lacking in the evidence there then in terms of understanding nuances like that. Some of it will be about the scripts that we carry forward. So certainly, for boys and young men, if they are exposed to that from their male caregiver, whether it's dad or stepdad or whoever it might be, that again becomes the blueprint for what they carry forward. But there are so many other factors involved in this, so many other risk factors around that it's hard to say for definite whether that would carry through for women as perpetrators as well.
Do you think there are some female offenders who are slipping through the system because of perceived abuse of children, but not necessarily of partners?
Yeah, I do think there is. I think, again, I'm not sure we have the hard evidence on this, but it's certainly a suspicion of, and a kind of a hunch, I guess, of some of us as researchers in this sector, that we're probably missing, particularly women who are offending in this way, because maybe the overriding concern is child, as you know, I'm not here to argue whether it should be or not, but perhaps the overriding concern and primary concern is the child. And so it's perceived as a parenting issue rather than a criminal justice relationship issue if a woman is being violent and abusive. So we have this suspicion that potentially a lot of cases that would involve child protection issues that would, so in the UK, will be dealt with by our social services sector, that maybe women are being responded to in a way to think about how they're parenting and how we improve that. And so officially, we might be missing some of those cases where there is some quite obvious violence and abuse within an intimate relationship there. When I speak to practitioners in the field, professionals in the field, they will say time and time again, we see women come up over and over again. I have a master's student who recently interviewed as part of her project social workers and asked them about their experiences of female perpetrated intimate partner violence and what they'd perceived, what their thoughts were about it. And people say over and over again, yep, we see that all the time. Yep, we see that. But there's like a diversion for but there's other concerns are seen as overriding. So we deal with that and we'll make the person a better mother. We'll make the person more emotionally intelligent or whatever it might be. Now, ironically, that actually might be okay. that might be all right that we're doing that, because there's another maybe conversation about how we label people as perpetrators and what that does to them, and how shame-based techniques in therapeutic intervention don't work. They're not good for people. So actually skirting around an issue and tackling the risk and the need factors actually might be what we need to do for people. And so it could be that that's working quite well for women, and that's tackling those relationship issues and any violence and abuse in relationship. It could be happening, but we don't know, because these might be people who are maybe slipping under the radar.
One of the issues in Australia is that we have very limited beds for men escaping domestic violence. And if women leave an abusive relationship and have teenage sons, it's difficult getting their sons a bed because men are excluded from most shelters. Is that similar in the UK?
Yes, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to pull the figure from the top of my head as to what we do have, but we do have some beds for men, correct? There is a statutory requirement for local authorities to provide some space, regardless of gender, sexuality, where domestic abuse has happened. So we do have some bed space. It's not comparable to women's bed spaces. I think this has the potential to be one of those controversial elements of this topic, in that I guess the fear is from activists is that if we do put in men's bed spaces or refuge spaces, that takes the slice of the pie away from women victims, which is already struggling, that sector, in terms of the right resource, etc., etc. So again, it's this funny balance here of being able to provide for everybody without removing from a different group of the population that equally is deserving of the help and the resource. So yeah, so it's laced with controversy when we start talking about the bed spaces and where the resources go. So as for men in the UK, we have the Mankind Initiative is a charity specifically set up to help male victims of domestic violence, and there are various other kind of helplines around as well. And I think the women's sector would say the same as well, that we need more. And also I think the argument or the conversation around who's got it worse and so therefore who needs more just feels a waste of time almost to have that argument. And again, I'm saying that very flippantly. It feels like it's removing our energy in places it shouldn't be. We need to put our energy into talking about helping everybody, no matter what their situation, rather than this section of the population needs it more. So we're going to fight for that, or this other section needs more of the pie. So let's fight for that. Actually, we need to be talking about relationship support, relationship abuse generally, in order that we can provide for everybody. But I know that's not a popular opinion. I know that, there will be people who will disagree with me on that. That's fine. So yeah, it's an interesting topic for sure.
I suspect a lot of the controversy comes from people. You get groups like the Not All Men, and whose behaviour are we training? Are we training women to not be victims? Are we training men not to abuse? Are we training women not to abuse, men not to be victims? How to tackle it is too hard. And again, I think everybody with an agenda comes out of the woodwork and butts heads is like, well, women are as bad as men. It's not an equivalence. It's not a competition. Every victim of abuse is a victim.
Yeah, I've fallen in that trap myself. There's been times when I sort of needed to wave the flag. Look, see, women can perpetrate domestic violence. Look, and actually, you're right. That almost doesn't matter. What matters here is that we tackle the causes of this problem, and that we start to look at what the evidence is telling us around what the risk and need is, that we have the support for victims in place, but that we also start to offer interventions that are evidence-based and that are really interrupting the violence and abuse that people are using in relationships. Domestic violence perpetrator programs, as they tend to be referred to as, have one of the highest dropout rates when it comes to looking at all different types of offending behaviour programs, if not the highest dropout rate. So something's not working here, and if we really want to tackle that and to stop this revolving door of people getting in relationships where they're continually violent and abusive, we've got to do something about that and kind of shake up what we're offering in order to protect all those different victims, women and men, and everybody in non-binary relations. But we haven't even talked about that. But any gender identity, we need to be able to be offering support for people to either change their behaviour or for people to be supported as victims, for sure.
But the whole Richard Spencer and Alex Keel having boiling water poured all over him, did either of those two women express any remorse?
I guess that's hard to say whether they have done at this point in time, maybe. I think the picture painted on the documentaries is that when they're in their kind of police interview, there's no remorse shown and very kind of cold. I kind of think I'm not surprised at that. I mean, I think it would be a rare person that would sit and break down in the police cell. It was me, I'm so sorry. I would guess that's probably a rare occurrence anyway. So what I do know is that they both have been, I don't think Jordan Worth is still now in prison, but they both have serving prison sentences, and they will do a lot of work around that with the professionals in those custody settings. There will be a lot of work around understanding why and thinking about responsibility and thinking about, what skills need to improve for that not to happen again. That rehabilitative approach that we have to criminal justice. And, the other thing we also know is that when people have perpetrated, the good chance is that they've got all that risk and that need that I've been talking about in their background. So they will also, men and women, will be victims in their own rights of the things that have happened to them in the past, more than likely. So they'll also be dealing with their own trauma responses to situations as well. And there'll be the sense of having to kind of immediately deal with that trauma, that adrenaline, those, the everything that's kind of going around their body and their head when incidents happen. So I think it would be surprising to see that remorse straight away. And I would hope that it's something that is expressed, I guess, later on from them.
Jenny, this has been incredibly fascinating. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a listener original production. It's hosted by me, Catherine Fox, and produced by Holly Mitchell and Ed Gooden. Executive producer is Dan Mullins. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.